Good morning, everyone. For those of you who just joined us, thanks so much for coming to the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's monthly breakfast webinar series. My name is Emily Vale. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance. If you can go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, make sure the drop down is clicked to go to everyone and not just the hosts and panelists. You can introduce yourself with your name and your affiliation, where you're zooming in from today. We've got a great group of folks on the call and from all over the state and all over the Hudson Valley, which is fantastic to see. So a couple of announcements before we go ahead and get started. The Hudson River Watershed Alliance just released our 2023 annual report. If you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I'm going to put a link to the chat. We are also in the middle of our annual appeal, and we have a generous donation from a longtime friend of the Hudson River Watershed Alliance who made a $10,000 donation, challenging our supporters to match that. So any gift really makes a huge difference for an organization of our size. There's no gift that's too large or too small. So we thank everyone who supported our work over the course of the past year. We thank everyone who's been a partner, a sponsor, an attendee, as an alliance across the region. It takes all of us to really make this work possible. So we just want to thank you for your support in all of the different forms over the past year. This is one of 25 programs that we've held, reaching over 900 people working on clean water and adapting to climate change. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started with today's topic. So this morning we'll be talking about the Climate Smart Communities certification program and opportunities for water and watershed-related actions. So the Hudson River Watershed Alliance is a regional nonprofit. We work to unite and empower communities to protect our shared waters. We support watershed groups, improve coordination across municipalities, and communicate as a collective voice on water issues across the region. We focus on watersheds because they're key to understanding and adapting to water-related climate impacts. Watersheds are really fundamental to understanding how water moves across the landscape, with big implications for flooding, drought, erosion, and water quality, including issues like harmful algal blooms, bacteria, swimmability, sediment, and so on. The Climate Smart Communities program is a New York State program that helps local governments take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to a changing climate. The program provides grants and free technical assistance to support communities in working through their certification actions. And you can learn more at climatesmart.ny.gov. I'll have some links after this portion of the presentation that I'll share in the chat. So communities can register for the Climate Smart Communities program by passing the pledge, and certified communities are those that complete and document actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change at the local level. And the value of being a certified community is getting increased points on certain state grant applications, along with having a framework for resilience and climate mitigation actions. So the certification program provides points for each action, and depending on the number of points, you can achieve bronze, silver, or gold level certification. 2 of the Climate Smart Communities actions are required, 13 are priority, and there's over 100 more possible actions across a wide range of topics, including water and watershed focus. So the actions are organized by 7 pledge elements, and there's 3 in particular that have cross-cutting themes with water. So those include land use policies in pledge element 6, enhancing community resilience in pledge element 7, and informing and inspiring the public in pledge element 9. There are a lot of opportunities for watershed collaborations with municipalities through Climate Smart Communities. Watershed groups and other partners may be working on projects that are eligible for certification points. There are maybe places where goals are aligned, and we're really encouraging folks to think about leveraging both municipal and community strengths. So just because it's the municipality going through the certification program, you don't have to do this work on your own. You can rely on some of the strengths, some of the existing projects of other groups, and take advantage of that through the program. So over the course of this fall, we've been focusing on this webinar series on technical assistance and case studies of water-related opportunities through the Climate Smart Communities program. If you're affiliated with a municipality, we hope you've been able to learn about some ways to get support for Climate Smart Communities work, whether it's through technical assistance or partnerships or taking advantage of some of these structures that might help gain some additional points. If you're not a municipal representative, you may be working on projects that can support your local communities through this program. All of our past webinar recordings are available on the Hudson River Watershed Alliance's YouTube channel, and I'll share a link for the specific playlist for our past episodes here on our webinar series. And I want to thank the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program and NUIPIC for funding this series, along with Hudson Valley Regional Council and Lauren Bunce for helping to co-organize this. Also want to give a quick shout out to the Hudson Valley Flood Resilience Network. One of our accomplishments in 2023 was launching a new strategic roadmap for the Hudson Valley Flood Resilience Network. This is a group of municipal leaders from the Hudson Valley that's working together on current and future flood risks. That's co-facilitated by the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, New York Sea Grant, and the Consensus Building Institute. So we provide programming, information, and networking opportunities. We just held 2 meetings in Yonkers and Albany back in November, and you can learn more about how to join and other aspects of our programming at hvfloodresiliencenetwork.org. Today, we're going to be talking specifically about one Climate Smart Communities action, which is in Pledge Element 7, Enhance Community Resilience to Climate Change, and we'll be focusing on the action Watershed-based Flood Mitigation Plan. So this is a map of the communities. You can pull this up at the Climate Smart Communities website. These are the municipalities that have received points for this action. And you can click on any of these markers and learn more about the types of plans that they've submitted to get these points. So the Watershed-based Flood Mitigation Plan can get 2 points if less than 75% of the municipality is included in the focus watershed, or 5 points if more than 75% of the municipality is within the focus watershed. There's some more information on the website about this action, and the plan should clearly demonstrate considerations of current and future conditions, community engagement, field work, hydrologic and hydraulic assessment, and flood mitigation strategies. And the plan should be created or revised within 10 years from when the application materials are submitted to the Climate Smart Communities program. So again, I'll share a link so you can get more details on that. And just a couple of examples of the types of plans that have been submitted for these points by communities. So Orange County received Climate Smart Communities points for their Moodna Creek watershed and flood mitigation assessment. The town of Shandaken has a townwide flood plan that they submitted for points. And the town of Red Hook submitted their Sawkill watershed and flood mitigation assessment for Climate Smart Communities as well. So there's a wide range of different approaches that you can take, and I'll be passing it on to Mark Carabetta from SLR Consulting to talk more about how Resilient New York is working and how it can fit into this framework, and municipalities can take advantage of some of that work for their own Climate Smart Communities points. So thank you so much again for joining us, and with that, I'll hand it over to Mark.
How's that look, Emily?
That's
Great.
great.
All right. Thank you, Emily. And hi, everyone. I'm Mark Carabetta from SLR, as Emily said, and I'm going to give an overview of the Resilient New York program, talk about the work we've done under that program, and walk through some examples of the types of recommendations we make as part of these flood studies. And then I'm going to jump around the eastern half of the state a little bit and kind of give overviews of different watershed studies. I kind of selected some recommendations that I think will be of interest. And then hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for question and answer at the end. So the Resilient New York program is a statewide initiative of the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation to make the state more resilient to future flooding and climate change. And the way that's done is conducting flood studies and ice jam studies to develop flood mitigation recommendations. And this involves a lot of hydraulic modeling, hydraulic analysis, geomorphic assessment of the streams. There is a stakeholder and community engagement element to the studies. Our firm was selected, SLR, to conduct flood studies in the eastern half of New York State. We're contracted through the Office of General Services, but we're working for the DEC. Another firm is doing similar work in the western half of the state. Sort of our colleagues doing that work. This map shows the studies that are currently underway by our firm under Resilient New York. It includes studies that have been completed either under the Resilient New York program or sort of a program that was a predecessor to the Resilient New York. It kind of evolved into the Resilient New York program. So looking at this map, you can see it covers the eastern half of the state. The green watersheds represent watersheds where our analysis is completed or is underway now. So starting in the north, this is in Franklin County is the Salmon River. That's a tributary it flows into Quebec and into the St. Lawrence River. We're doing a flood and ice jam analysis in that watershed right now. We did our field work in the spring. Next to that are the Great and Little Chazy rivers that flow into Lake Champlain, and those studies were completed, I believe, over a year ago. We have the main stem of the Mohawk River, which we actually kicked off several years ago, and that's been sort of in a holding pattern until we pick up again. The blue area are 14 different tributaries to the Mohawk main stem, which were flood studies that we did prior to the start of the Resilient New York program that have all been completed. This is Catskill Creek. This is the east and west branch of the Delaware rivers. And then we've done quite a few studies in both Rockland County. That includes Munisqueongo Creek, the Mawa River, the Sparkill Creek, the Hackensack River, the portion of it in New York State, the Saddle River, and the Ramapo River. Those have all been completed. And then in Westchester County, we've got a lot of work underway right now. The Mamaroneck River, Blind Brook, those have been completed. Beaver Swamp Brook is underway now. We're near wrapping that one up. And then the Bronx River, Hutchinson River, and Sawmill Rivers. Well, the first two, the Bronx and the Hutch, are underway now, and the Sawmill we should be kicking off very shortly. You can see the watersheds in red are up and coming. I know that some of the ones that will be coming up sort of immediately early in the new year are Otsego County, those three watersheds in Otsego County, and then the Ausable and Bouquet rivers, which are also tributaries to Lake Champlain. Those will be kicking off in the spring. So lots of work going on. Just to be clear, we take on and do the analysis, but the list is provided to us by the DEC. So we don't, as part of our process, we don't select which watersheds are on the list or which ones are going to be done. That gets provided to us by the DEC. I get asked that question quite often, you know, when is our watershed, where is it on the list? And that's not something that we select. I realized I skipped a couple. That very small watershed in Ulster County, that's Main Street Brook in Kingston. And then this is Woods Brook in Hoosick Falls, where studies have been done. Kind of a parallel program, some similarities, some differences to Resilient New York program is the LFAs, which stands for Local Flood Analysis. This was a program that was developed following Tropical Storm Irene by the New York City DEP. This map shows all the LFA analyses that our firm has completed, quite a few of them since 2013, and there are still some underway right now. And you can see them listed. There are several others that have been done by other firms. The New York City DEP, after the big floods of Tropical Storm Irene that really devastated the Catskills region, put the local flood analysis program into place as a way to come up with scientifically based flood mitigation recommendations that could be implemented, could kind of direct funding for implementation of those recommendations. And municipalities would hire firms to conduct a local flood analysis, and then would have access to that funding to implement flood mitigation recommendations. And quite a few, there's lots of examples throughout the DEP watersheds where LFA recommendations have gone forward to be implemented and constructed. A little introduction to our team at SLR. So my office is in New Paltz, New York, and we've got a team of water resources engineers, water resources scientists. So we focus on work relating to rivers and wetlands, and a lot of hydrology and hydraulic analysis. We analyze dams. We sometimes work on dam removal projects. We design many channel restoration projects. We do lots of flood hazard mitigation analysis, and then sometimes design and implementation of those projects. And we spend a lot of time in rivers, both for work and for play. So I'll describe the process that we go through, whether it's an LFA or a Resilient New York study. We start with outreach to the community and data collection. We try and learn whatever we can about the watershed, flood history. We'll go into stream gauge information and FEMA studies and previous reports. We'll talk to people in the watersheds. Often there's a emergency response person or a DPW employee who knows more than anyone else about the flood history, what areas have been damaged in floods. Those are the most critical people to talk to. People who have firsthand experience with the flooding. Sometimes there's expertise that exists in the watersheds, and we want to gather that information. As you see in the photos here, that often involves getting together in a room, marking up maps. We use this information. It's informative to know the flood history, and it's also, if we could get photos and high water marks during floods, we use that to calibrate and validate our hydraulic modeling. It gives us increased certainty about the conclusions that we're reaching with our modeling. We're often able to acquire the hydraulic models that FEMA developed as part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And those models are a very useful tool that we use for our flood analysis. We're able to use existing models for most of these studies, and it eliminates the need for us to go out and do very expensive survey and developing of our own models. That is necessary sometimes, but wherever possible, we use existing FEMA hydraulic models. And then the next step in the process is identification of high-risk areas. So through all the community outreach and everything we're able to learn, we're able to establish certain areas within our study area that have experienced repeated flooding. Maybe it's a road intersection, or maybe it's a certain neighborhood or business district that's been subjected to flooding in the past. And while we're looking at the entire watershed, we focus in on these high-risk areas and do rigorous hydraulic analysis. And then I'll show you a map. This is an example from the Munisquiongo Creek watershed, and you can see the outline of the watershed here as it drains to the Hudson River. And then the red areas are the high-risk areas that we identified through our community outreach and through other information that existed. We were able to identify these areas, and we're able to make flood mitigation recommendations, some of them pertaining to the entire watershed and others specifically to these high-risk areas. And the ones pertaining to the high-risk areas tend to be more specific. You know, it might be there's an undersized bridge, or there's some floodplain restoration that needs to happen there to reduce flooding. Then we get into field assessment and investigations. We'll get out in the field. We'll confirm measurements of bridges and channels throughout the watershed. You can see in the top photo, there's a bridge there, and one of our scientist, Kaya, is measuring the bridge to confirm the size for our hydraulic modeling. We always, as part of our hydrologic analysis, include an assessment of future flows given the impacts of climate change and the the impact that it's having on moisture in the atmosphere and the potential for increased severity of rainfall events going into the future. So if you look at our analysis and some of our conclusions, we'll look at, say, the 100-year flood event as it exists, as we understand it today. It might be a certain magnitude of flood. And then on top of that, we'll look at a future flow, and that might be increasing the magnitude of that 100-year flood event going forward into the future, 50 years or 100 years, and looking at an increase, and then doing that same evaluation under these future flows. Then we'll do lots of hydraulic modeling, hydraulic analysis, develop flood mitigation strategies, and then the end product is a flood mitigation report that looks at different flood mitigation alternatives, makes flood mitigation recommendations, and then that's made available to the community as recommendations. And it's important to understand those recommendations could then be used to apply for funding to design and implement those flood mitigation recommendations. You know, our reports don't lay out a full engineering design of some of these mitigations. Let's say we recommended that a bridge is undersized and is contributing to flooding and needs to be replaced. We would make that recommendation in our analysis, and then the municipality would take that recommendation, apply for funding for the design of, and then construction of the replacement of that bridge in that example. So I like to call this our flood mitigation toolbox. You know, people often ask, what do you mean when you say flood mitigation recommendations? And there's a whole range of recommendations where we might make. Every watershed is different, every river's different, every study is a new analysis, and there's no sort of cookie cutter approach, but there are sort of a range of tools that we use. I always say, you know, here's our toolbox. There might be a recommendation or that's not shown here that's unique to a particular flood prone area. So I'm going to go through this in a bit of detail, and I'll provide some examples of what I mean to sort of demonstrate. So starting on the left, we'll often, as we start our flood analysis, and we've learned that there's a flood prone area, we'll look at our hydraulic models, and we'll run what's called a natural conditions model, which means taking out any potential restrictions to flow in the channel. And that might be a dam, it might be a bridge or a culvert. We'll take that out of the model, and then we'll run the model again, and we'll look at how much does that reduce flooding by getting rid of those potential constrictions to flow. We're able to see the difference between existing conditions and if that bridge or culvert didn't exist. And it's a good way of analyzing it for us. I mean, it doesn't mean we're going to recommend the removal of a bridge that's essential. It just means we're able to identify that that bridge is undersized and is acting as a constriction, and it needs to be replaced with an adequately sized structure. So we may recommend the removal of a bridge or a dam if isn't needed, but then we may recommend its modification or its replacement if it is needed. Same is true of dams or culverts. And I'll give some examples of where we've looked at undersized bridges. We may look at alteration of the channel if the channel is undersized, especially in more urbanized area. We often have channels that have been walled in. Their floodplains have been developed, and the remaining channel that exists isn't large enough to convey a flood flow. So when a flood happens, water spills out of that channel and floods the neighborhood. Sometimes there is an adequate floodplain or no floodplain at all. Floodplains are part of the river. They're essential for conveying flood flows. And if that floodplain has been developed and there's not enough space, we may look at reclaiming or creating or enhancing existing floodplain. And I'll walk through an example of that too, sort of a schematic illustration of how that works. Then there's planning and data collection recommendations we can make. Many times we start to do our hydrologic analysis and we look for stream gauge information. Stream gauges are essential for understanding how much flow there is in the channel during a flood event. Historically, we could look back, there's gauges that have been in place for over 100 years, and we're able to look at that data and understand trends. We're able to analyze that gauge data, and we're able to very accurately say what is the 100-year flood event, what's the 50-year flood event, how has that changed over time. In watersheds without stream gauges, we're kind of in the dark. We don't know. We can only estimate that information. We'll say, well, how big of a flood was Tropical Storm Ida? And in some watersheds, we don't really know because we didn't have stream gauge information. So often we'll recommend the installation or the reinstallation of USGS stream gauges. We often see lax flood code enforcement, so we'll recommend improved code enforcement. We'll recommend better wetland protection, limiting impervious cover, or maybe zoning modifications that relate to flood mitigation. And then river or watershed management often applies. Sometimes there's stormwater detention that would improve flood mitigation, or management of sediment or debris. And then all the way to the right side, there's individual building treatments. Sometimes homes are simply built in the floodplain, and there's no other strategy that's going to reduce flooding other than flood proofing, elevation of homes, or voluntary buyout, sort of a managed retreat type of strategy where you're simply getting those homes or businesses out of harm's way. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So we talked about floodplain enhancement, and I want to talk a little bit about a recommendation that we often make, and it often requires a little bit of extra explanation so people understand what we mean when we say floodplain enhancement, or the creation of a floodplain bench or a multi-stage channel. And I'm gonna describe that in sort of just a schematic fashion. So here's a river. You have a neighborhood on one side, and under normal flows, everything is fine. During a low flow event, the water is very spread out and shallow in the channel. It's not great for wildlife habitat. Maybe this river's gone through some alteration in the past. And then during a flood event, that neighborhood gets flooded because the channel lacks a floodplain, and it's not large enough to convey a flood flow. So in this case, in our analysis, we'll determine what's the appropriate size of that channel. The main channel should be able to convey the bankful flood event, which is a flood event that occurs every 1 to 2 years. And the channel should be adequately sized. Channels don't just convey water, they convey sediment. If you over widen the channel, it may convey a flood flow, but it won't be adequate to convey the sediment, and that channel will fill up with sediment because it's overly wide. In this case, we want to right size that channel to convey flood flows, and then create floodplain. And that may be through a floodplain bench or a more extensive floodplain. And that floodplain conveys flows that are bigger than the bankful event. That's when water spills out onto the floodplain and conveys those flood flows. And then we create a low flow channel to concentrate the low flow so it's not spread out and shallow during low flow events. It's good to support aquatic habitat. So once that's constructed, it looks something like this in cross section. And now the low flow is concentrated in the low flow part of the channel. A bankful event fills up the main channel, and then a flood event conveys the flood flows. And those homes are no longer subjected to flooding in a big flood event. What we see in some situations is there's homes on both sides, and we can go through a similar process here with the low flow channel, the bankful channel, and the floodplain. And in this case, we've reduced flooding from this neighborhood, but it's been at the expense of this home, which had to be relocated in order to construct the floodplain bench. And we often see that. We don't have the space in some of these developed communities to convey the flood flows, enhance the floodplain without a component of managed retreat where some homes are being relocated. We're often making recommendations that relate to managed retreat. That term is often being, today's current conversations about flooding often include the term managed retreat, which we define as the purposeful, coordinated movement of people and buildings away from the risk. That may be relocation of buyouts and relocations of individual buildings. I have an example here. This is from our study on the Ramapo River. There's a section of Main Street and some businesses that are prone to flooding. The green line represents the 10-year flood event, and the red line represents the 100-year flood event, and the orange, the future flows 100-year flood event. And you can see this road and the businesses are flooded even in the 10-year flood event. In this case, based on our analysis, there was no other strategies that were going to reduce flooding in this area. So what we recommend is the relocation of the flood-prone businesses and basically the abandonment of that section of road and the sort of rerouting of traffic to bypass that section of road. That's kind of has a managed retreat component to it. I also wanted to give an example of when we talk about undersized bridges and how they contribute to flooding. I wanted to walk through that example a little bit. So in this case, we're looking down on a bridge. You can see the bridge is sort of concentrating flows as the water passes through the bridge. And, this may be a pedestrian bridge. It might be a railroad that's crossing the river. In the upper left, you see the bridge sort of now in profile. The river is flowing under the bridge, seems to be passing under it just fine. But under higher flows, that bridge may not be adequately sized and may cause a hydraulic constriction that causes water to back up. Now, if it's a steep water course and that it's just a small bridge, that increase in water surface elevations may only extend a few tens or hundreds of feet upstream, and it may not be impacting anyone. It may subject the bridge to scour. It may mean the bridge is going to overtop or wash out. But if that's a large bridge and it's a fairly flat water course, that impact of the undersized bridge and that increased water surface elevation may extend quite a ways upstream, and it may contribute to flooding. And that's part of our analysis. Here I show an example on this is on Blind Brook in Westchester County. So in the aerial, you'll see here's the brook flowing south. And here you have I-95 and you have the Metro North Railroad next to each other crossing over Blind Brook. And upstream of this crossing, you see during Tropical Storm Irene, there was a flooding of that neighborhood, which happens from time to time. This is for that same area, this is the profile for Blind Brook from the FEMA flood insurance study. And these are widely available, the flood insurance studies for each county. And if you look through those, you'll see these flood profiles. And it takes a little study to understand these. And I've had to piece together two separate sheets, but here you have the profiles of Blind Brook under different flood events. So this top line represents the 500-year flood event. And then this dashed line is the 100-year flood event. And the one under that's the 50. This is that railroad and I-95 crossing. And when you see this large head loss or drop in water surface elevation at a bridge, and then this long sort of straight lines going back from the bridge, that often indicates that crossing is hydraulically undersized. And this caught our attention during this flood analysis, and we wanted to look at that more closely. So here's the crossing. Over the top of this crossing is I-95 and the railroad. The railroad crossing was built over 100 years ago, and then when I-95 was built, I think that may have been in the 1950s, they used that same crossing, but they extended that culvert. They just lengthened the culvert to span under both I-95 and the railroad. The crossing is about 25 foot wide and about 16 foot high. Is my colleague Miguel measuring the crossing. And we know that that's hydraulically undersized because the bankful width of the channel is much wider than 16 feet. So as part of our hydraulic analysis, we tried modeling a 60-foot wide crossing at this location. And we looked at, this is the output of our hydraulic model. It looks similar to what we saw in the FEMA study. The red line represents the 100-year flood event, and the blue line represents the 100-year flood event with the crossing that I showed you under the railroad and I-95 increased to a 60-foot wide crossing. And you can see there's a six-foot vertical drop in flooding during the 100-year flood event if that crossing were to be upsized. And you could see that the backwater from that undersized crossing extends over a mile upstream and also influences the hydraulics at several other bridges going upstream. So there's a very flood-prone neighborhood upstream of that crossing. Now, this presents some challenges, this recommendation, because obviously it'd be very expensive to upsize that crossing. Railroad crossings are especially challenging because the grade that's required have to remain very flat for railroads to be able to cross them. You can't put in sort of a bit of a hump like you would if it was a traffic going over it. And also because so much water is backing up behind this crossing that if you were to upsize the crossing, there's the potential for increasing of flooding downstream of the crossing. You could potentially increase peak flows downstream of the crossing. We come across this situation quite a bit in our studies with undersized railroad crossings, and it presents a real challenge for these communities, and it's sort of an ongoing conversation. So here's a map of New York State showing the physiographic provinces, and the stars represent kind of some examples of the flood studies that we've done. And I thought we could go through this and kind of quickly show you some examples of our flood mitigation analysis and recommendations. And I'm going to go through them fairly quickly, and I'm not going to be able to go into great detail on them, but hopefully give an overview of the types of analysis we've been doing. So I'm going to start in the north there on the Great Chazy River analysis we did. These are tributaries they're in the Adirondacks, and they flow down into the Champlain lowlands and into Lake Champlain. Those watersheds, the Great and Little Chazy watersheds, have been very impacted through the work of the industrialist William H. Miner, who built many hydropower dams through these watersheds in the early part of the 20th century. And these have had a great impact on the watershed. You can see some of them in these photographs. And many of these still exist today. You can see this big powerhouse that was built in the 1920s. And our staff is out here visiting this same powerhouse a couple of years ago. And you can see the penstock running right down the river. This was done in an era where environmental protection and sort of concern for the rivers was very secondary to these industrial developments. So we did a lot of analysis in this watershed looking at ice formation. Ice jamming is a big problem. In these watersheds, ice moves down into these communities, gets jammed up, and then even in a fairly modest bankful flood event, combined with the ice jamming, you'll have pretty substantial flooding. So we analyze not only the ice jamming, but also the formation of the ice and how that ice forms and where it forms. And we find that there's a lot of ice formation on the slack water that forms in the impoundment of a dam. So the presence of the dams and the presence of these impoundments really contributes to all that ice forming and moving downstream. These dams are defunct. Many of them are derelict dams. They were created for the purpose of that hydropower, but are not needed in today's day and age. So often we're recommending the removal of these dams. That ice forms and moves downstream. This is the hamlet of Champlain, and you can see all the ice moving. The ice, as it moves downstream, encounters the backwater of the lake levels in Lake Champlain, which extends up the Shazy River, and then where that happens, the ice really runs aground and causes flooding as it flows through the village of Champlain here. We've made a number of recommendations in addition to the dam removals that involve upsizing of undersized bridges where ice jamming occurs, and also creation of these ice rafting areas, which essentially floodplain areas where ice could be pushed out onto the floodplain rather than moving into populated areas and damaging homes and businesses. Now I'll move to Steel Creek, which is in Herkimer County. Steel Creek is a tributary to the Mohawk River and the Erie Canal. I like to talk about this one because it's an example of flood mitigation recommendations that were then the community applied for funding, had further analysis done, and then the design and the construction of a flood mitigation project. This is Steel Creek looking upstream. You can see in the foreground the Remington Arms Dam. This used to provide water and power to Remington Arms. You could see the remains of a little entrance to a race where water would flow down to Remington Arms, which of course manufactured firearms even during the Civil War period for the Union Army and has existed for a very long time. But that dam is no longer serving a purpose. There's an undersized bridge crossing. And then looking at the project area from upstream, you can see it's a very developed floodplain. The channel has been straightened. There's no floodplain, and there's roads on both sides really pinching in the channel. Looking back through historic documents, we found from 1894, over 100 years ago, that many of these same problems existed, and they really understood that the problem was being driven by the presence of this dam. And some of this language is really interesting, that during floods, streets were torn up and otherwise injured. One thing I found interesting, not just the damages to the roads and the property, but also considerable sickness relating to the flooding that occurred. And the flooding, which was positively dangerous to limb and life. So we were able to find these documents and find that this problem has existed in this village for over 100 years. So as part of our flood study, we drew a lot of conclusions. We made a lot of recommendations to reduce flooding in this area, sort of a multifaceted strategy for reducing flooding. And we laid out this sort of concept sketch, which then, as I mentioned, the village was able to acquire funding to design and construct this project. It started with property buyouts. Frequently flooded properties were acquired. People were willing to take buyouts. Those homes were demolished and removed. Some of the roads that service those homes were either fully removed or portions of them were removed. They were narrowed and made into one way to make more room for the river. That Remington Arms Dam at the downstream end was removed. This dam was raising the channel bed up approximately 13 feet. After the dam was built, gradually the area behind the dam filled in with sediment, cobble right up to the crest of the dam. And then that raised channel bed was contributing to flooding. The channel upstream of the dam was lowered and widened so that it could convey flood flows. And then floodplain was created along the sides of the channel. You can see this is looking downstream in that whole area. It's still pretty raw because it's under construction, but that whole area is now floodplain to convey flood flows. A bridge was replaced. This is at Richfield Street at the upstream end of the project area. Undersized bridge that would cause flooding during the 25-year flood event was replaced with a bridge that could now convey the future 100-year flood event. An existing bridge at the downstream end was retrofitted to make it convey more flows. The channel was deepened under the bridge. This is just upstream of where the dam was removed. So now it'll pass the 100-year flood event. And because we lowered the channel bed, we had to relocate utilities that passed under the creek, which included the installation of a sanitary pump station because the gravity sewer had passed underneath the creek and had to be relocated. We did creation of in-stream habitat. A lot of those stream features, pools and riffles, had been lost, and those were recreated in the stream. And then that floodplain was revegetated with native species. So it's a real multifaceted project. Funding came from many sources, but the result was you could see the water courses flowing north on this slide. This was prior to the project, the extensive flooding that would occur during the 100-year flood event. And this is our modeling showing after the project is implemented, and much of those flows are being conveyed on our created floodplain. I won't go into detail, but here's the range of grant programs that were necessary for that project to happen. There were various matching requirements that the village had to meet, but it was really a whole list of funding that supported, whether it was the bridge replacements or the dam removal or the floodplain creation or the utilities, many funding agencies. I'm going to jump now to Woods Brook. I know I'm a little short on time, so I'm cover a couple more. Woods Brook is in Hoosick Falls. It's a agricultural watershed that then flows down into the village of Hoosick Falls. And the water course, Woods Brook, goes underground for much of this length. And we looked at, we worked with the community and looked at several scenarios, which ran the gamut from daylighting the creek, removing buildings, replacing culverts where it flowed under streams. And basically what we showed, there's a range of scenarios that we worked with the village, depending on the willingness of property owners to take buyouts. We were able to look at several scenarios, and the one that the village chose was one that had a combination of improvements, culvert upsizing, daylighting of the channel, floodplain restoration, and removal of buildings. There was one building called the Dodge Building that is unlikely to go anywhere at this time, so that's left in place with the channel flowing underneath it. But you can see, if you compare the left image to the right, you can see the pretty substantial reduction in flooding. This is the 50-year future flow that is modeled, and we see quite a reduction in flooding if those recommendations are implemented. I'm going to now jump down to Munisquiongo Creek. This is in Rockland County, and this is the Garnerville Arts and Industrial Center. It's sort of a revitalized area. It used to be old mill dams, and there's a lot of different businesses and vendors and artists in these buildings. During Tropical Storm Irene, it was devastated. All the channel actually flows between all these buildings and did a lot of damage as sections of buildings collapsed. This is in plan view, and as part of our analysis, we looked at the influence of this building that sits on top of the creek here, and that was added at one point during the development of these properties. And we looked, this gets all jammed up with debris and causes a hydraulic constriction. It's just downstream of a dam, and we looked at modeling what would happen if we remove this building. Would that reduce flooding? So this is the output of our hydraulic modeling during the 100-year flood event. You can see, and it's pretty close to what happened during Tropical Storm Irene. Water spilled out of the channel and got out on the road, flowed all through the Arts and Industrial Center. And we model it with that section of building removed that I showed in the image, and it greatly reduces flooding and sort of keeps the water in the channel during a large flood event. And that's something that I know we spoke with the business owners, and that was something that was a viable option for them to remove that building. I'll jump down to the Mamaroneck River, and this is probably the last one I have time for. The Mamaroneck River watershed, and this is a tributary to the Mamaroneck River called the Sheldrake River. It flows through a very densely populated area of the village of Mamaroneck. lots of flooding gets triggered through this area due to the undersized channel. It's simply not large enough to convey flood flows. It is also subject to backwater from the Mamaroneck River, which backs up and influences flooding on the Sheldrake. So we had sort of a two-pronged set of recommendations here. The first was to create floodplain and replace undersized bridges along this section of the Sheldrake. That would have some modest flood reduction. And then as a longer term plan, as you can see in the dashed yellow line, sort of a long-term greenway or linear park that would be created along the Sheldrake that would consist of the river and floodplain that would be adequately sized to convey flood flows. It would require some taking of buildings, and it's presented as a long-term strategy where the village could acquire property over time and reduce flooding. So here on the left, you see the 10-year flood event and the flooding that it creates. You can see the cooler colors are the deeper flood flows and then or deeper flood depths, and then the warmer colors are the more shallow flood depths. And then if you contrast that with the image on the right, it shows comparing the flood reduction during the 10-year flood event with that first scenario implemented with the floodplain benches. And then this shows that longer term strategy with that sort of linear greenway created along the Sheldrake. Now, the reason we're showing the 10-year flood event here, and there's quite a bit of reduction, but during larger flood events, the backwater from the Mamaroneck River actually backwaters and starts to flood this area regardless of these improvements. So it's sort of a it's an improvement that's going to have great benefit during modest 5-year events, 10-year events, but once you get to the big flood events, then you need to address some problems further downstream around the confluence with the Mamaroneck, which are also recommendations that we made during our study. So sometimes there's a certain prioritization that needs to occur in the way these recommendations are implemented. And Lauren, why don't Emily, why don't I pause right there and just check in with you? I think it's probably time for me to stop. I have like 1 or 2 more examples, but I think that's probably.
Yeah, we've got some good questions here, so I think we
Okay.
should jump over to those. Thank you so much, Mark, for walking through those examples and the practical explanations of how some of these flood reduction strategies actually work. I think it's been really helpful. So we've got a couple questions about some of the data, some of the modeling that I want to take first. So the question about some of the information that you use to inform the reports. Do you use NAC records for data collection around bridge and culvert conditions?
We do when it's available. I know we've worked with the DEC and the various soil and water conservation districts. We often have access to the NAC data, and that tells us if based on the NAC visits, if the culverts are hydraulically undersized and if they are barriers to fish passage. And that'll often tell us that this culvert's been identified as undersized and we need to take a closer look at it. And then we'll do our own analysis of those culverts. And that's certainly helpful information to have. And we also, sometimes in our reports, we're able to, provide references to the NAC data. So the municipalities are made aware of it and to use that data as well as ours. Yeah, very helpful.
Great, thank you. We've got 2 questions here about how the village of Ilion and that Steel Creek example, how they were able to identify, apply for, manage the funding sources, how they were able to move from recommendations to formal engineering designs. What's the role of the municipality? Who leads that process? If you could speak a little bit more to that case study, which seems like a really successful one.
Yeah, that's a great question because obviously we'd love to see, 100 more Steel Creeks. We make a lot of recommendations, and it's great to see them get and the funding's out there to do these projects. It's the gap in between is exactly that question. Like, how do the municipalities take those recommendations and turn them into a project. And I don't have all the answers to that, but I'll do my best. In that community, we had a I think it related to one important factor, and is that they'd been repeatedly flooded, and there was a real will to get something done, community support for it. And it's unfortunate, but sometimes that's what's required to sort of drive a community to take action. They there were the village retained a grants specialist, which I think was very smart for them. These could be complicated process to apply for all the grants and understand which grants are the best fit for a particular project. You know, I know one of the funders was the GIGP, Green Innovation, and they'll fund like a floodplain restoration, but they won't necessarily pay for a bridge replacement. Bridge New York is targeted towards replacing undersized bridges and culverts. There's the WQIP funding, and I'm not an expert at the funding sources, but these are paired together in certain ways to maximize how much of the project they cover, and minimize the amount of match that the village has to put in. There was also support from the Herkimer Oneida Planning Agency. It was a planner there who was very instrumental in guiding the community and the grant specialist as to which grants to apply for, and so that was a very important component. I think there was a real willingness from DEC as we went through the permitting process for those projects. So it's really many steps required, but I think some of those are the important ones for why that project was so successful. And there's other examples even right next to that on Fulmer Creek, which is in German Flats, a similar sort of floodplain enhancement project, and some bridges replaced and buyouts of properties where it was necessary for it to happen. That's one other thing I should mention probably is the necessity of those buyouts to make room for the project. It never could have happened. We couldn't, as it was, the design of the project was a squeeze. You know, we had to squeeze in what we could. It'd be nice to do a real floodplain restoration with acres of floodplain, but we had to squeeze it in there. We had to work around existing utilities and roads and existing bridges. And those buyouts were the essential first step. So that's probably important to note as well. You can't make room for a river in a floodplain and also leave all those houses and roads that are built right up against the side of the creek. Something's got to give, and that's often the case.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. I think we have time for one more question, which is regarding that in some of the recommendations, there's still predicted flooding. Can you talk a bit more about the cost benefit thinking that residents or community leaders might be considering when accepting a design that will result in lessened flooding, but doesn't eliminate flooding like that 10-year event on the Sheldrake that you were showing?
Yeah, it's a tricky, as we do these analyses, like on the Sheldrake, clearly the only solution is to make more room. And we try and that's a good observation. Even if what we recommended is implemented, probably at quite a bit of cost, there's still going to be flooding. It's just not going to be every year, every 5 years. It's going to be less frequent flooding, and when it does flood, there's going to be flood reduction benefits, or flood reduction. In a 100-year flood event, the flooding won't be as severe. I think in a case like that, our analysis is a first step. We recommend, that you could see on that image, there were these dashed yellow lines recommending the concept of sort of a floodable greenway, but exactly how that gets implemented, we can't really say that at this stage because it involves buyouts of properties. It could be maybe on the right-hand side of the creek, it'd be on the left-hand side of the creek, it'd be on both sides. There's a lot of sort of flexibility in the way that could go forward. And we don't want to make our recommendations so exact and prescriptive that the community thinks they only have that one choice. It's the concept that needs to be implemented, and there's some latitude in the way that gets implemented. And maybe they could do gradually over time an increase in the size of this greenway as buildings get removed. And as that happens, there'll be more flood reduction benefit. So we tend to model sort of one scenario. We present it as a concept, but there's sort of in a case like that that's that complex. There's not just one exact answer. I don't know if that answers the question exactly, but this is something the community has to weigh. You know, in the Steel Creek example, the modeling shows that I never use the word eliminated flooding because you can never do that, but we've greatly reduced the flooding there. But in some of these examples like Mamaroneck, where it's so densely developed and it's so costly to go back now and make room for the river, that there's often going to be decisions that the community needs to make about how aggressive to be in making the room for the river and the sort of resulting flood reduction. So I don't know how well I answered that question, but it's a complicated question as to, you know, and that would be a step. The benefit cost analysis, we don't do them as part of the Resilient New York. It's a real labor intensive exercise to look at the flood reduction benefit. What are the reduced damages at each building, and what would be the benefit of that project, and comparing it to cost. It would probably be a necessary next step as part of an analysis like we did on the Sheldrake.
Great, thank you so much. So we're at time, and I apologize if we didn't get to everyone's questions. We got some really good ones here about buyouts and funding and processes and modeling data. And so we're looking forward to hopefully continuing these conversations. We just want to make sure we're at time because we know that you all have busy days and we want to keep to the time limit of the program. So just want to thank everyone again for joining us this morning. Thank you so much to Mark for presenting, Lauren for being on tech support, the Estuary program, and NUIPIC for supporting this series. And we look forward to seeing you in the new year.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Thanks, everyone.